How to read people like a book. Introduction. The power of understanding others without words. Imagine for a moment that you're in a room full of people. Some are smiling, others are engrossed in their phones, and a few are feigning interest in a conversation. Now stop and ask yourself, how many of those emotions you think you're seeing are real? How many are social masks? Most of the time, people don't say what they're really feeling, but their body, their gestures, their gaze, even their silence, do it for them. Learning to read others isn't simply a social skill. It's a tool of silent power that allows you to navigate the world with an advantage, better understand those around you, detect hidden intentions, prevent misunderstandings, and create genuine connections. It's like having an emotional map in real time. And the best part, everyone can develop it if they learn to observe. In a society saturated with words, where more is said than heard, and more is published than felt, being someone who understands what is left unsaid is a valuable rarity. It's not about spying or manipulating, but about being aware, about perceiving what most people miss. A gesture, a pause before answering, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a tense posture when faced with an awkward question. All of this communicates, all of this says more than 1,000 speeches. And that's where true human reading begins. In the cracks of automatic behavior. In what happens when someone thinks no one is looking. But why is it so important to develop this skill? Because our decisions, relationships, and opportunities are deeply tied to our ability to correctly interpret others. Think of all the times you've been misunderstood or misunderstood someone yourself. How many arguments could have been avoided? How many different decisions would you have made if you had understood what was really going through the other person's mind? This skill not only protects you from deception or deception, but also gives you a huge advantage in everyday life. Whether it's a job interview, a negotiation, a romantic date, a family argument, or even just listening to a friend, knowing what the other person is really feeling or thinking completely transforms the interaction. Understanding others without words is also an act of silent empathy. Not everyone knows how to express themselves. Not everyone has the emotional tools to express what they feel. Some grew up repressing their emotions. Others simply don't have the emotional vocabulary to do so. But their bodies, their reaction patterns, their energy in conversation, reveal everything. When you learn to read that, you're not only understanding better, you're caring better. You're avoiding premature judgments and misunderstandings and creating a space for real connection. That, in the modern world, is almost revolutionary. Hearing is easy. We hear voices every day. But understanding, that's something else. Understanding requires presence, mindfulness, real interest. While hearing only involves your ears, understanding involves your whole being. You observe, listen, analyze, connect. When someone speaks to you, their verbal content may be saying one thing, but their body may be shouting something else. You can hear someone say they're fine, but if their voice trembles, their gaze avoids yours, and their hands keep moving, are they really okay? Those who know how to read what's not being said have the power to intervene at the right moment, to offer genuine help, or simply to be present more authentically. Let's take an example. Imagine you work in an office and a colleague arrives on a Monday as usual. They greet you with the same smile, but you notice their tone is lower than usual, they barely look at you, and their body is slightly hunched over. No one else notices. Everyone assumes they're the same as always. But you notice the difference. It's not paranoia. It's perception. You can approach and ask if everything is okay, and maybe that's just what they needed to talk. Or in another scenario, you're in a negotiation, and your interlocutor tells you they agree to the terms, but they repeatedly shift in their chair, swallow, and avoid holding your gaze. Does they really agree, or are they just giving in under pressure? Anyone who doesn't see these signs could end up losing the negotiation or causing conflicts in the future. Reading people also means reading the energy in the environment. You walk into a room and you can sense if there's tension, even if no one says a word. That feeling that something isn't right, that there was an argument earlier, or that someone isn't being truthful. These intuitions aren't mystical. They're the result of thousands of microsignals you unconsciously perceive: the heavy silence, averted glances, crossed arms, a rigid body. Learning to make conscious what your unconscious already perceives is part of this process. It's transforming your intuition into a precise skill. Another example. You're in a conversation with someone who seems kind, even charming. Their words are perfect, but their smile is pinpoint, not engaging their eyes. They lean back, maintain a defensive posture, and their gestures are contained and calculated. There's no spontaneity. Here you are, someone who acts, not feels. Does this mean they're lying? Not necessarily, but it does mean they're hiding something, that there's a mismatch between what they say and what their body expresses. And this incongruity is the basis of a good reading. Don't be swayed by words alone. Congruence is key. When what is said, what is felt, and what is shown are aligned, there is truth. When they aren't, there's something missing or being hidden. Throughout this audiobook, you'll learn to detect all these nuances. It's not about becoming a human lie detector, but rather an aware, perceptive, and emotionally intelligent person. You'll discover how emotions manifest in the body, how to read eyes, voice, posture, habits, and involuntary reactions. You'll understand why someone acts the way they do, even if they don't even know it themselves. Because often, people don't even understand themselves, but their behavior gives them away. The way they respond to praise, how they change when receiving criticism, what they do when they feel observed, how they behave when they're at a disadvantage. All of this has patterns, and those patterns can be read like a book. This is a journey that transforms the way you relate to others, but also to yourself. Because by learning to read others, you inevitably learn to observe yourself more deeply. You discover your own unconscious gestures, your emotional reactions, your areas of discomfort. Reading others makes you more human, more compassionate, but also more strategic. Because deep understanding is not at odds with clarity. Knowing what someone is like allows you to decide who you want to connect with, who you trust, who you help, and who you stay away from. It's not all about adapting. Sometimes it's about understanding to protect yourself. So what you're about to learn isn't just a simple set of observation techniques. It's a new way of looking at the world. More attentive, more connected, more lucid. You'll develop the ability to see what's invisible to others, to grasp what's going on in a person's mind without them telling you, and above all, to use that knowledge to build more authentic relationships, avoid unnecessary disappointments, and communicate from a more intelligent place. Understanding others without words isn't a talent. It's a skill that can be trained. And today, here, you've taken the first step toward mastering it. But before continuing, please write in the comments which city you're listening to this audiobook from, and if this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now. This way, you'll be sure not to miss any content that nourishes your mind and brings you closer every day to the life you truly deserve. There's no time to waste. Now, let's continue. Chapter 1. We all show patterns. Every human being acts, reacts, and expresses themselves from a deep place that they often don't even fully understand. That place is shaped by the sum of their past experiences. From childhood to their most recent relationships, from moments of success to emotional wounds that never fully healed. And although many try to hide it behind a mask of normalcy, the truth is that all of us, without exception, display patterns. A pattern is a behavior that is repeated, a way of interpreting the world that has become automatic. It is not a conscious act, it is a learned response that emerges effortlessly. And if one knows how to observe carefully, these patterns can be detected with surprising clarity. Consider, for example, someone who reacts defensively every time they're questioned. It doesn't matter if the question is gentle or even well-intentioned, that person becomes defensive almost by reflex. Why? Perhaps in their past, they were heavily criticized, judged, or not allowed to make mistakes. Their mind has learned that every question is a potential attack. So, when challenged, their body tenses, their tone changes, their gestures close up. That reaction isn't about you or the question itself. It's a manifestation of their personal history. Just as others, for example, go out of their way to please or avoid conflict at all costs, not because they truly want to, but because they've learned that's the way to feel safe or accepted. Reading someone like a book is, in part, learning to see beyond the act itself and begin to ask yourself, where does this come from? What sustains it? What past experience is being repeated here? People tend to replay their unresolved emotions in new situations. That's why someone who was betrayed in a romantic relationship may display excessive jealousy with a new partner, even without any evidence. Their mind isn't reacting to the present, but to the emotional memory of the past. And that's how patterns work. They're old responses disguised as current decisions. When you understand that, you stop taking many things personally and begin to understand that most people aren't responding to you, but to their own emotional history. These patterns manifest in various ways. Some are verbal, repeated phrases, constant justifications, avoidance of certain topics. Others are physical, repetitive movements, gestures that appear in moments of discomfort, averted glances. And many others are emotional. People who always play the victim role, who live on the defensive, or who constantly seek external validation. All of these are indicators of a mind that has learned to operate under certain patterns and that, unless it has worked deeply on itself, probably continues to operate from those programmings. The fascinating thing is that once you learn to see these patterns, you begin to notice they aren't random. There's a logic behind them. For example, someone who lived in an unstable environment will tend to seek control in their current relationships. Not because they want to manipulate, but because control gives them a false sense of security. Or someone who grew up feeling invisible may constantly talk, interrupt, or exaggerate because they need to feel seen. This doesn't justify the behaviors, but it does explain them. And when you understand where they come from, you can respond more accurately. Perhaps with boundaries, perhaps with understanding, but no longer from confusion. A pattern can also be the way a person shows affection. Some people only know how to show affection through service. Others do so with gifts, some with words, and still others barely express it, even though they feel it. And this has nothing to do with how much they love, but with how they learn to show it. If you observe carefully, you'll notice that each person has a learned, emotional language. If you can decipher that language, you'll understand their actions even when they're not what you'd expect. So, what may seem cold to you may simply be their way of caring for you without making you uncomfortable. But patterns don't just speak to the past. They also predict the future. A person who consistently avoids responsibility will likely continue to do so if there's no process of change. Someone who manipulates with guilt will continue to do so if it works for them. That's why recognizing patterns is not only useful for understanding, but also for anticipating. When you identify someone's thinking and behavioral style, you can predict how they'll react in certain situations. Not because you're a fortune teller, but because you understand the mechanisms behind it. This is invaluable in work environments, family relationships, friendships, even negotiations. You can better prepare yourself, decide how far to get involved, and set healthier boundaries. Observe the people you frequently spend time with. What is their typical reaction to a problem? Do they tend to blame, avoid, seek solutions, or withdraw? What kinds of phrases do they repeat when they feel pressured? What behaviors appear when they feel rejected? All of this speaks to their internal pattern. And the key is to observe with neutrality. It's not about judging, but about understanding. When you observe with judgment, you close down possibilities. But when you observe with curiosity, you open doors to understanding. And that's where true reading begins. When you stop reacting from your own pattern and place yourself in a state of active, empathetic, and lucid observer. Even you, the one listening to this audiobook, have your own patterns. Some help you, others limit you. You may tend to be quick to distrust, or always want to be right. You may find it difficult to say no, or you may shut down when you feel someone getting too close. These are all mechanisms that once protected you, but which today may be conditioning the way you relate to others. Learning to see patterns in others also serves as a mirror that allows you to begin to see your own more clearly. One of the most common patterns is the fear of being vulnerable. Many people camouflage this with sarcasm, coldness, and exaggerated self-sufficiency. But if you know how to observe, you'll see that beneath that armor lies a deep need for connection. It's easy to look at the surface and dismiss someone as arrogant or insensitive, but if you dig deeper, you might see someone who learned that showing emotion was a risk, and so they chose protection over openness. Understanding this allows you to approach it from a different place, or even decide whether or not to do so, but with awareness. There are people who constantly sabotage their own opportunities. They say they want something, but when they get it, they destroy it or walk away. It's an unconscious pattern that responds to a fear of success, a fear of exposure, or the belief that they don't deserve it. And they repeat it over and over again, without understanding why they always end up in the same place. Reading these patterns allows you to see beyond the immediate behavior and understand the root. And if you're the one repeating these types of cycles, You can also begin to deactivate them through awareness. Repetitive thinking styles are also observed in language. People who constantly say, "I can't," "I'm not good at this," "nothing ever works for me," are repeating an internal narrative that has become their identity. They say it without thinking, but they believe it. And they act from there. The same thing happens with those who constantly play the victim or those who live on the defensive. These repeated phrases are clear clues to where they operate mentally and emotionally. Listening carefully to this type of language allows you to understand someone's internal map without them explaining it to you in detail. Pattern reading isn't infallible, but it's accurate when done with constant observation. It's not enough to see a single behavior. The important thing is to see how it repeats itself in different contexts. For example, if someone gets nervous once, it may be a one-time occurrence. But if they get nervous every time money is discussed, or every time a commitment is mentioned, then that's a pattern. And it's that level of repetition that gives you real information. That's why, to read someone like a book, you need time, patience, and attention. And once you develop that ability, you can't unsee it. Because human patterns are everywhere, waiting to be understood by those who know how to look. Chapter 2. Body language never lies. The body speaks, even if the mouth is silent. That's one of the most compelling truths when it comes to deeply understanding people. Most people believe that communication occurs only with words, but in reality, body language represents an immensely significant part of what we truly express. The body, unlike the mind, doesn't lie that well. It hasn't learned to construct sentences or design arguments. It only reacts. That's why, when someone says something with their mouth, but their body shows otherwise, the body has the last word. And that's where real reading begins, where we stop listening only to the verbal and begin to observe the truth. The most common physical signals of the unconscious appear all the time. They are those automatic gestures that people don't control because they aren't thinking about them. For example, a person may be speaking confidently, but if they constantly touch their neck, scratch the back of their neck, or cover their mouth, their body is showing discomfort, doubt, or insecurity. These movements aren't accidental. They are manifestations of internal tension that emerge through the body. When the unconscious senses it's in danger, the body responds in subtle but revealing ways. And it's there, in those small details, that you can see what others aren't saying. Observe someone's feet when they're talking to you. Although it may seem insignificant, feet usually point where that person really wants to be. If someone is with you, but their feet are pointed toward the exit, it's very likely they want to leave, even if their face is smiling. These kinds of details are key because they're harder to consciously control. People tend to pay attention to their face, their hands, their voice. But feet, posture, body inclination, all of these still act from the truth. A person who feels comfortable will open up their body, show their chest, have their palms visible, and lean slightly toward you. On the other hand, a person who feels threatened or uncomfortable will withdraw their body, cross their arms, avoid showing their hands, and step back. Eye contact is also an inexhaustible source of information. It's not simply a matter of whether someone is looking at you, but how they're looking at you. A gently held gaze often indicates interest and connection. A rigidly held gaze may indicate an attempt at intimidation. Constantly avoiding eye contact can be a sign of discomfort, guilt, or insecurity. But you should also notice if the person avoids your gaze only on certain topics or at specific times. This indicates that this isn't a general habit, but rather a specific reaction that deserves your attention. Additionally, excessive blinking, looking down when discussing something intimate, or erratically moving the eyes are all signs the body is trying to manage internal stress. Gestures also have their own code. When someone rubs their hands together, they're usually trying to calm themselves. When they bite their lips, they may be feeling tension, doubt, or emotional restraint. When someone scratches their eyebrow or eye for no apparent reason in the middle of a delicate conversation, they may be unconsciously trying to not see what they're hearing or saying. None of these movements are random. They're the physical language of the unconscious. Each of us has a way of releasing tension, and if you observe carefully, you'll be able to recognize each person's self-soothing gestures. Once you identify them, you can tell when something is causing them stress, even if they don't say so. Body posture also reveals much more than meets the eye. Someone standing tall, with their shoulders back and chin slightly raised, conveys confidence and openness. On the other hand, a person slouching, with their shoulders drooping and their gaze downward, is likely feeling embarrassed, sad, or insecure. Furthermore, the position of the arms and hands can indicate someone's level of emotional openness. Crossed arms can be a sign of defensiveness or disagreement, especially if combined with a tense facial expression. But if the arms are crossed in a relaxed manner, and the person is smiling genuinely, then it may simply be a comfortable posture. That's why it's vital not to observe a single gesture, but the whole. Body reading is holistic. Each signal must be understood in context. Another important point is synchronization. When someone is emotionally aligned with you, their gestures tend to sync with yours. This happens naturally when there's a real connection. For example, if you tilt your head slightly and the other person does the same, if you breathe at a similar rate, if you smile at the same time, this indicates rapport, that is, emotional attunement. On the other hand, if you smile and the other person maintains a neutral or rigid expression, if you lean forward and the other person moves away, this can indicate a lack of connection, disinterest, or even emotional resistance. Detecting these moments of desynchronization helps you understand whether or not you're building trust, without needing to be told. In conflict situations, body language often reveals the true internal state of each party. For example, a person who maintains a rigid posture, a clenched jaw, a furrowed brow, and tense arms, even when speaking in a calm tone, is holding back anger or frustration. That tension can't be disguised with soft words. The body reveals what the mind is trying to hide. Even microfacial expressions, those reactions that last only a fraction of a second, can reveal genuine emotion before someone suppresses it. A fleeting look of contempt, a smile that fades too quickly, a look of fear that appears and disappears without warning. All of these are signs of the unconscious peeking through. Imagine you're in an interview and the interviewer maintains a constant smile, but their jaw is tense and their eyebrows only slightly raise when you mention a certain topic. This indicates that they're uncomfortable, surprised, or even suspicious of that point. They may not express this verbally, but if you know how to read them, you'll understand that it's a sensitive or important point for them. This skill allows you to adjust your approach, respond more intelligently, and navigate any type of human interaction more successfully. In the realm of personal relationships, reading body language can make the difference between genuine connection or creating misunderstandings. If a partner says they're fine but avoids eye contact, keeps their arms crossed, doesn't touch the other as they used to, or responds with monosyllables, it's likely something isn't resolved. Words may lie out of politeness or fear of conflict, but the body always speaks the truth. Those who know how to observe can offer support, ask questions at the right moment, or even prevent a situation from escalating unnecessarily. Now, it's important to clarify that no gesture should be interpreted in isolation. Crossing your arms doesn't always mean rejection. Touching your neck doesn't always imply nervousness. Looking away isn't always a sign of disinterest. Everything should be interpreted together and, above all, with common sense. The essential thing is to observe patterns, consistency, and context. What is certain is that the more you observe a person in different situations, the more accurate you will be in interpreting their body language. It's not about making quick judgments, but rather developing a keener sensitivity to nonverbals. Finally, remember that you, too, are being read all the time, even without knowing it. The way you enter a room, the way you look, the way you move, the way you listen also communicates. Developing this awareness not only allows you to understand others, but also to adjust your own presence. You can project more confidence, more openness, or more empathy simply by adjusting your posture, your gaze, or your tone of voice. And when this awareness becomes part of you, you no longer communicate only with words. Your entire body becomes a clear message, and you become someone impossible to ignore. Because those who master body language master the art of understanding and being understood without needing to say too much. Chapter 3. Micro-expressions, the windows of the soul. Micro-expressions are one of the most sincere and brief manifestations of the human emotional world. They occur in a fraction of a second, usually less than half a second, and reveal what a person truly feels before they can consciously censor or control it. These fleeting signs on the face act like tiny cracks through which authentic emotions seep in, becoming an invaluable resource for those who wish to read people deeply. Detecting them requires practice, attention, and a keen sensitivity to facial muscle changes, but the effort is rewarded with an almost instantaneous understanding of others' internal states, something that far surpasses any spoken word. To begin training our perception of microexpressions, it's necessary to understand the basic emotions that tend to manifest through them. Joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, and contempt. Each of these emotions has a specific facial muscle pattern. For example, anger is expressed with furrowed eyebrows, tense eyes, and pursed lips. Surprise, on the other hand, raises the eyebrows, opens the eyes, and relaxes the jaw. These movements happen so quickly that if you blink, you could miss them. That's why many people overlook these crucial signals and end up misinterpreting what others are feeling or thinking. Imagine being in a seemingly cordial conversation with someone who, while smiling, lets out a micro-expression of contempt, a slight unilateral lifting of the lip. Although imperceptible to most, those who have developed this skill will notice it immediately and understand that something in that relationship is out of alignment. Perhaps that person feels superiority, disagreement, or even rejection toward you, but doesn't dare express it verbally. That micro-gesture says it all. In a professional setting, for example, a leader who detects a micro-expression of fear in a collaborator during an important meeting can intervene with empathy, offer support, or adjust the approach before the problem escalates. This is how effective communication is built, which depends not only on what is said, but on what is perceived. Another revealing example occurs in job interviews. Candidates often take care with their verbal and body language to project confidence and competence. However, if a question touches on a sensitive topic, such as a previous bad work experience, micro-expressions of discomfort, fear, or sadness may emerge. Sadness is expressed by the corners of the lips turned down, drooping eyelids, and a slight tilt of the head. Capturing this gesture allows the interviewer to probe more sensitively or change the course of the conversation to avoid triggering unnecessary resistance. The power of micro-expressions also extends to one's personal life. In a relationship, detecting a micro-expression of disgust or contempt during a conversation about sensitive topics can be a sign of deep conflicts that need attention. Often, these emotions go unspoken for fear of hurting the other person or to avoid discussions, but they end up undermining the relationship from within. Reading them early can open the dialogue from a more understanding perspective and prevent unnecessary breakups. Conversely, a sincere micro-expression of joy, even if fleeting, can confirm that what is being emotionally built is solid and genuine. Effectively interpreting micro-expressions also requires a clear context. It's not about seeing a single signal and jumping to conclusions. The human face is complex, and gestures often blend together. For example, someone might show mild surprise and sadness at the same time if they've just received unexpected and painful news. This type of emotional blending is completely normal and requires a more refined eye to interpret accurately. Observing the environment, the topic of conversation, and the person's emotional history are key to avoiding misreading. One strategy to improve this skill is the use of image training and slow-motion video. There are platforms and courses designed to identify these facial microsignals, where you can practice recognizing patterns until your eye becomes accustomed. But beyond technical training, it is essential to develop an attitude of full observation, free of prejudice, that allows you to view the other person with genuine curiosity. Those who judge before observing lose precision. Those who seek to test their hypothesis before opening up to the other person's real experience end up projecting more than they perceive. Reading micro-expressions is an art that is perfected when one learns to look with presence. An important detail that many overlook is that micro-expressions aren't always negative. Some people display a fleeting flash of joy when discussing something that connects to a deep longing, even if they want to remain serious on the surface. Detecting these signs can be equally useful, helping you identify hidden passions, sources of authentic motivation, or topics worth exploring further in a conversation. In the world of negotiation, for example, noticing a micro-expression of genuine interest when a potential collaboration is mentioned can be the perfect impetus to close a mutually beneficial deal. This ability to quickly interpret emotions also improves your own emotional reflexes. It makes you more empathetic, more prudent, and more precise in your responses. When you see sadness where others see indifference, or when you detect fear where others see anger, your words can touch more deeply, your support can be more precise, and your impact more lasting. It's not about becoming a perfect reader of the human face, but about becoming a person more connected to what others feel, even when they don't say it. Micro-expressions are not just windows to the soul, but gateways to truer, more human, more transformative communication. The development of this skill is gradual, But each small advance brings you closer to a level of social intelligence that very few achieve. Being able to read what others can barely conceal gives you a silent but powerful advantage. Not to manipulate, but to understand. Not to dominate, but to help open what was closed. In the end, the human face is like an open book, but only for those who have learned to read between the lines. And you, from now on, have the tools to start doing just that. Chapter 4. Voice and Tone, Emotions That Escape. The human voice is one of the most powerful and revealing instruments we possess. It not only serves to produce words, but also conveys an emotional universe that goes far beyond the literal content. In every everyday interaction, every conversation, every phone call or speech, there are hidden messages that filter through not through what is said, but through how it is said. Subtle changes in tone, volume, and pace can reveal more about a person than their actual words. Listening carefully to these nuances is like tuning into a deeper frequency of the human being, where true emotions lie. Tone can convey enthusiasm, sadness, fear, or falsehood with a clarity that even body language sometimes fails to achieve. A person may say, "I'm fine," and yet, if their tone is flat, clipped, or hesitant, we instinctively know it's not true. Pitch and rhythm alert us to inconsistencies, and these inconsistencies are gold for those who know how to read people. When someone speeds up their speech, they may be nervous or anxious to hide something. If they suddenly lower their volume, they may be feeling embarrassed or afraid. If their rhythm becomes irregular, if they suddenly pause awkwardly, or if they breathe differently, they may be hesitating or even lying. The voice is intimately linked to the autonomic nervous system. Therefore, emotional changes inevitably affect how they sound. Those who learn to detect these signals accurately can read what words are trying to hide. Detecting tension in a voice, for example, requires tuning your ear to the point of noticing even a slight stiffness in the throat, labored breathing, or an abrupt change in pitch. Tension manifests when the body tries to maintain control, but emotions escape through the voice. Fear is perceived in slight stuttering, in the repetition of certain words, in a rising tone as if seeking approval or defending oneself. Lying, on the other hand, is often accompanied by overcompensation in tone, either overly confident, as if seeking to convince, or too flat, as if avoiding emotional engagement with what is being said. The key is incongruity. When the tone doesn't match the expected emotional content of the message, we are likely dealing with a repressed emotion or a disguised truth. It's also revealing to observe how a person's voice changes when talking about topics they're passionate about. Enthusiasm is easy to notice. There's a natural rise in pitch, an increase in speed, a vibrant energy that runs through every syllable. This is especially noticeable when the person isn't expecting to be observed or evaluated, as in a casual conversation. The contrast between how someone talks about their hobbies and how they talk about their job, for example, can reveal what truly matters to them. If the tone becomes monotonous or forced when talking about a personal relationship, something may be wrong. The voice, in many ways, is a direct emotional mirror. It's also important to observe the final intonation of sentences. A sentence that ends with a rising tone, as if it were a question, can denote insecurity or a need for approval. One that ends with a falling tone, firm and clear, usually conveys confidence or authority. People who master their intonation can more easily influence others because their tone conveys emotional coherence. It's no coincidence that the most influential leaders in history have had unmistakable voices. Their way of speaking connected emotionally with the masses because they knew how to use their voice as an extension of their deepest emotions. Pacing also speaks volumes. A slow pace can show reflection, calm, or emotional mastery. But it can also be a tactic to buy time when inventing or plotting a lie. An excessively fast pace, on the other hand, can signal anxiety, overenthusiasm, or an attempt at manipulation. We must learn to correlate these factors. Pitch plus pace plus content equals emotional truth. It's not about making quick judgments, but about learning to calibrate our perceptions. Listening with this depth is a skill that requires training. It requires full attention, but once developed, it becomes an emotional compass for navigating human interactions. Good negotiators, for example, pay more attention to the sound of their interlocutor's voice than to what they are literally saying. In a negotiation, if someone starts speaking faster or louder than usual, they may be emotionally engaged, perhaps unwittingly giving in. If their tone lowers but their content is challenging, they may be adopting a passive-aggressive strategy. Sales professionals, therapists, leaders, teachers, and even attentive parents know that the voice is the most reliable clue to understanding a person's true state. You don't need a degree in psychology to detect these signs. You just need to train your listening skills. To begin developing this skill, it's recommended to record real conversations, with permission, of course, and then listen to them without paying attention to the words, only to the tone, pace, and volume. This trains us to separate form from content. Soon, you'll begin to notice patterns. You can also watch interviews without sound and then listen only to the audio to practice both forms of reading. First visually, then auditorily. You'll be surprised to discover that many times your instinct already knew it. You felt something wasn't right, but didn't know why. Now you will. Just as the body reveals emotions with movement, the voice reveals them with vibrations. Each vibration carries an energetic charge that impacts the other person, and also the person who emits it. The next time you speak to someone, don't just listen to their words. Feel their voice. Is it warm or tense? Is it congruent or forced? Does it sound present or distant? The art of voice reading is the art of reading the soul. Not everyone will master it, but those who do will have an incomparable human advantage. Because understanding others accurately begins with fine-tuning our listening to the invisible. And in that emotional silence is where truth resides. Chapter 5. Spontaneous Reactions. Where the Truth Lies. A spontaneous reaction is like a soul reflex. It arises before the mind has time to intervene, disguise, please, or lie. When we carefully observe an unfiltered response, we access a raw, direct, and revealing truth about what a person truly feels, believes, or fears. These reactions, which often escape in a split second, are gems for those who seek to understand others deeply. For example, imagine you ask someone an uncomfortable question. Before they respond with words, they may look away, swallow, flinch slightly, or show a micro-expression of surprise, anger, or fear. That reaction before verbal rationalization is where the truth lies. Not what they say, but what they couldn't help but show. These spontaneous reactions appear most often in unexpected situations. When someone receives sudden news, when they find themselves in an emotionally charged conversation, or when they face a contradiction that jeopardizes their public image, this is when their emotional system responds first. Therefore, a fundamental skill for reading people is learning to detect those first seconds, those brief gestures, that nervous laugh, or that rapid blinking. There's no need to interrupt or pressure, just observe. The person reveals themselves through their automatic reaction, and only then will they try to compose their posture, choose their words, and regain control. That's when they've already lost part of the mask, and you, if you're attentive, will have noticed. But how can you differentiate an authentic reaction from a learned one? Authenticity has a raw, unfinished, natural quality. It's like a melody that plays before it's been rehearsed. It's noticeable in the body, a sudden shiver, an involuntary grimace, a brief exclamation, an expression that doesn't match the verbal content. In contrast, a learned response tends to be polished, socially acceptable, and lacking in spontaneity. Most people aren't trained to control those milliseconds before speaking, so even those who appear to have a controlled personality can reveal a lot if observed at key moments. One powerful technique is to ask questions unexpectedly, introduce awkward pauses, or use silence as a tool to force the other person, in their need to fill it, to reveal something they hadn't planned to share. Authentic reactions are also often more congruent with real emotions. For example, if someone claims to be happy, but their tone is subdued, their face tense, and their posture closed, they are probably expressing a learned emotion rather than a lived one. In contrast, when someone is truly emotional, we see it in their pupils, their rapid breathing, their open gestures, and the vibration of their body. That energy cannot be easily simulated. Professional actors take years to imitate authentic reactions, and even then, there are nuances that cannot be faked without enormous skill. Therefore, as a trained observer, your mission is not to judge or confront, but to detect what the person is unwittingly revealing. An excellent exercise for training this ability is to watch interviews or public statements from well-known figures. Observe how they react to uncomfortable questions. Often, you'll see a micro-gesture, a forced pause, a repetition of words, or a subtle change in intonation before they answer. These clues aren't mistakes, they're revelations. Another technique is to pay attention to what happens when a mistake or interruption occurs in the middle of a conversation. How the person reacts, whether they become uncomfortable, laugh, or frustrated. The unplanned response holds more truth than any structured discourse. In everyday life, you can also observe the reactions that arise when someone is corrected, when they feel exposed, or when their expectations aren't met. There is fertile ground there for understanding who someone really is. By differentiating what's learned from what's genuine, you also develop greater compassion and understanding for others. You realize that many people act automatically, guided by responses they've memorized for years to protect themselves or fit in. Understanding this isn't a license to manipulate, but an invitation to empathize. Reading people like a book doesn't mean using their information against them, but rather tuning into their truth, even when they're not ready to verbalize it. In fact, when someone feels understood without having to explain themselves, a powerful, almost magical connection is created that breaks down social barriers and builds deep trust. This skill is also essential in critical moments. In negotiations, discussions, interviews, sales, or difficult conversations. Being able to detect a person's initial reaction allows you to adjust your approach, calm tensions, ask the right questions, or know when to stop. It's not just about analyzing the other person, but about establishing a more human rhythm in the interaction. One where everything is not verbal, where emotional nuances have space, where the body and energy also speak. By honing this sensitivity, you also become more aware of your own reactions. You begin to notice when you yourself are responding from emotion, when you are defending a learned position, and when you are being authentic. Ultimately, spontaneous reactions are bridges to the unconscious. They allow us not only to read others, but to read what lies beyond the discourse. They are those fleeting glances, those brief tremors, that word inadvertently repeated. They are the fingerprint of a real emotion, and if you learn to detect them, you will discover that human behavior has a code, a profound logic beyond words. This is one of the most powerful keys to human reading. Not everything that is worthwhile is said, and not everything that is said is worthwhile. Authenticity lies in what escapes control. Right there, lies the truth. Chapter 6. Congruence between what they say and what they do. When we observe someone speaking, we should pay attention not only to what they say, but also to how they say it and, more importantly, to what they do while saying it. Congruence between words and actions is a critical sign of authenticity. Often, the body becomes the silent betrayer of what is really going on inside a person. When someone claims to be calm, but their hands tremble slightly, their voice wavers, or they avoid eye contact, there is already an incongruity that reveals an underlying emotion. Anxiety, fear, or even lying. This difference between verbal and nonverbal communication is no accident. The body has fewer conscious filters than language. That's why learning to detect these misalignments between what is said and what is physically expressed is one of the most powerful skills one can develop in human communication. Let's take a job interview as an example. The candidate claims to have great self-confidence and experience leading teams, but while saying this, he or she shrugs slightly, lowers his or her head, and doesn't maintain eye contact with the interviewer. These physical signals contradict his or her verbal discourse, and a trained observer would perceive it as a lack of conviction, nervousness, or insecurity. Or imagine a couple having a serious conversation. One of them says, "It's fine, I'm not upset," but does so with a dry tone, a clenched jaw, crossed arms, and labored breathing. The words say one thing, but the body screams another. This disconnect between form and substance is key to understanding that not everything said should be taken literally. The body offers a second layer of truth that, in many cases, contradicts the explicit content of the message. Emotional inconsistencies also manifest when a person feigns enthusiasm, but their eyes lack sparkle and their face lacks movement. Or when someone says they're happy for another's success, but their smile is forced, their eyebrows are slightly furrowed, and they maintain a rigid posture. This combination of signals tells us that their joy isn't authentic. They may be feeling jealousy, frustration, or simply feigning friendliness. The key is not to focus exclusively on words, but to observe the full picture of behavior. Truly congruent communication occurs when what is said, felt, and done are aligned, and this is perceived with evident naturalness in the body and voice. When there is a disconnect, the body reflects it, and this lack of harmony is an important warning sign. Another example is public speaking. A politician may claim to be committed to a cause, But if their gestures are monotonous, their voice lacks conviction, or their body language shows disinterest, people sense it, even if they can't consciously explain it. This phenomenon occurs because we constantly pick up unconscious signals. Our brain has a radar for detecting inconsistencies, and even if we don't know exactly what bothers us, we sense it. That's why we sometimes say, "I don't know why, but it didn't feel good to me." That intuition is, in reality, a quick emotional and bodily reading of the inconsistencies we notice. Congruence can also be used positively. When a person expresses gratitude and their face lights up, their tone of voice is warm, and their gestures match their words, the recipient feels that emotion authentically. This is what happens in a sincere hug or a genuine apology. The message is not only in the words, but in how it is embodied in the body. Body language reinforces emotional intent, and this coherence generates trust. Therefore, in interpersonal relationships, whether professional, familial, or friendly, congruence builds credibility, while incongruence generates distrust and distance. In more delicate contexts, such as a confession or a critical situation, congruence can be the line between believing someone or not. Imagine a teenager saying they didn't do something serious, but they can't hold your gaze, they bite their lower lip, and their breathing becomes more rapid. Even if they say, "It wasn't me," their body is conveying guilt or fear. The same thing happens with declarations of love, promises, or apologies. If body language doesn't accompany the words with emotional harmony, the message loses its power. The most perceptive people, even without formal training, often pick up on these signals, even if they don't consciously analyze them. This disconnect can also manifest itself in the professional sphere. A boss who claims to be open to new ideas but crosses his arms, frowns whenever someone suggests something, and doesn't pause to listen is sending a contradictory message. Although his verbal intention is to open the door, his physical behavior shows resistance. This creates an atmosphere of distrust in the team. In contrast, a truly open leader demonstrates this with a relaxed posture, leaning slightly forward when listening, nodding his head, and making eye contact. The body accompanies the intention, and the message becomes congruent, creating a safer environment for communication. Even in sales, this consistency is crucial. A salesperson who speaks enthusiastically about a product, but whose face is expressionless, their body static, and their tone of voice flat, fails to convey confidence. The customer senses something is off. But if that same salesperson speaks with genuine enthusiasm, using their hands, with a twinkle in their eyes, and a firm voice, the message becomes coherent and persuasive. It's not just what is said, but how the message is delivered that creates impact. It's important to note that not all inconsistencies indicate a lie. Sometimes people are nervous, afraid, or emotionally overwhelmed. Therefore, the reading must be contextual. It's not about making immediate judgments, but rather observing patterns. If a person is usually open and expressive, but suddenly becomes restrained or rigid when talking about a specific topic, this is an indication that the topic is causing conflict or insecurity. The key is to notice the difference in their usual behavior, rather than labeling every gesture as a sign of deception. In the end, congruence between what we say and what we do is not only a tool for detecting the truth in others, but also a compass for our own authenticity. Being consistent with what we feel, say, and show strengthens our relationships, our communication, and our presence in the world. Congruent people inspire trust because they don't generate dissonance. They speak with their body, voice, and words in sync. Therefore, learning to detect this harmony, or its absence, is essential for understanding others with depth and precision. Those who master this reading access a deeper dimension of human emotional reality. Chapter 7. What involuntary habits reveal. Long before a person speaks or tries to explain what they feel, their body and behavior have already spoken for them. Among all forms of nonverbal communication, involuntary habits occupy a privileged place because they are, precisely, the most difficult to control. They are those small actions that a person repeats day after day without realizing it, and that act as open windows into their inner world. From the way they bite their nails, to the way they arrange their clothes, to the way they move their feet while talking, every habit has a reason for existing, an emotional and psychological origin that reveals more than words could conceal. An involuntary habit is like a repeated signature of the soul, automatic, insistent, almost invisible, but deeply revealing. One of the most common is the constant movement of the feet or legs while sitting. Although it may seem like simple restlessness or boredom, this behavior often indicates pent-up anxiety, suppressed impatience, or accumulated emotional tension. The legs don't lie because they are beyond conscious control. While a person is careful with their hand gestures or facial expression during a conversation, they rarely pay attention to their feet. Therefore, observing these details is key to detecting states of discomfort, a desire to escape a situation, or even unspoken enthusiasm. A foot pointing toward the exit during a conversation, for example, can suggest an unconscious desire to end the interaction, regardless of what is being said verbally. Another common habit is compulsive playing with objects. Pencils, rings, glasses, buttons, or anything else the hands can find. This type of behavior reveals nervousness, insecurity, or a need to channel internal tension. When a person doesn't feel an emotional control of a situation, they seek to distract their hands to self-regulate. Observing how much they manipulate an object, whether they do so gently or aggressively, whether they squeeze it, twist it, or destroy it, allows us to deduce their internal state with considerable precision. The more compulsive the gesture, the greater the emotional burden they are trying to release. There are also physical tics, such as constant throat clearing, neck rubbing, face touching, lip pursing, or excessive blinking. Although some have a biological or neurological component, they are often conditioned reflexes caused by stress, social awkwardness, or the need for validation. For example, a person who repeatedly touches their nose while speaking may be showing signs of doubt, insecurity, or even omitting a part of the truth. Similarly, rubbing the neck or nape of the neck often indicates emotional overload, mental fatigue, or internal resistance to what is being said or heard. These habits are not arbitrary. They are expressions of the body that seek to release or compensate for underlying emotional tension. Some habits are so specific that they become unique clues about someone's personality. For example, a person who constantly rearranges objects around them, whether papers, utensils, or anything in their environment, may be manifesting a strong desire for control. For these people, having an orderly environment generates a sense of calm in a chaotic internal world. Another example is the habit of talking excessively or filling every silence. Although socially interpreted as extroversion, it is often a way of avoiding inner silence, where uncomfortable thoughts or unresolved emotions reside. In this case, the habit is verbal, but its function remains emotional, to avoid contact with oneself. Body tone also influences involuntary habits. Someone who walks briskly even when there's no rush, who is always in a hurry, who eats quickly, or who waits desperately in line, may be displaying an internal programming of constant alertness. Deep down, it's not that they're in a hurry, but rather that they're living from a state of mind of time scarcity or hyperdemand. These behaviors are conditioned reflexes of a mind trained to never stop. Therefore, when we see someone moving as if they always have to get somewhere else, what we're probably seeing is a person who doesn't know how to be present. Involuntary habits also appear in specific contexts, such as when a person stares at their cell phone, even when notifications aren't received. This seemingly innocent gesture can be a sign of emotional avoidance or a need for external validation. The habit of constantly checking one's phone may reflect an addiction to external stimuli because the internal world is uncomfortable or painful. The same pattern applies to those who repeatedly scratch a body part or bite objects, such as pens, during meetings or stressful situations. The body always looks for an escape route when the mind feels trapped. On the other hand, personal habits or rituals, even if they seem harmless, are often anchored in previous emotional experiences. Someone who needs to check the door several times before leaving or who repeats certain rituals while sleeping may be unknowingly managing past traumas or deep-rooted insecurities. These rituals create an artificial sense of control and protection from what is perceived as external uncertainty or internal emotional chaos. If observed without judgment, these habits can serve as clues to understanding fears that the person hasn't even verbalized. The fascinating thing about involuntary habits is that, being automatic, they are not filtered by rationality. They don't seek to deceive or pretend. They are authentic manifestations of unconscious patterns, repeated with millimetric precision in different areas of life. Therefore, when you want to truly know someone, it's more useful to observe what they do when they're not being observed or what they repeat over and over again without noticing. Habits are like emotional fingerprints. Unique, constant, revealing. Learning to interpret them is not only a tool for understanding others, but also a powerful way to know ourselves. Because in our obsessions, repetitions, and automatisms, the stories we haven't yet told are also written. And ultimately, every repetitive behavior has an origin, an intention, and a history. It can come from childhood, a traumatic experience, an unmet need, or a belief that became a habit. The body memorizes emotions through action, and those actions, when they become habits, become language. A language that speaks without words, that screams in silence, and that, when we learn to listen, tells us exactly what someone needs, what hurts them, or what they are trying to hide. Therefore, involuntary habits should not be corrected without first being understood, because they are not mistakes. They are clues. They are maps. They are signs of a person's deepest emotional state. Chapter 8. How to identify lies without saying a word. Detecting a lie isn't an act of direct confrontation, but rather of subtle observation. Most people assume that deception is only uncovered through an obvious verbal contradiction or a confession, but in reality, the body often speaks before the tongue, and it does so with relentless honesty. Nonverbal language becomes the silent witness to the truth, revealing inconsistencies that words try to disguise. A glance that wanders at just the right moment, an unusual pause before responding, an automatic gesture of discomfort, or a smile that doesn't reach the eyes are all tiny cracks in the facade of the lie. They aren't conclusive evidence on their own, but when interpreted together, they form a clear and revealing pattern. The first step to identifying a lie without saying a word is to thoroughly understand the typical indicators of an authentic response. Sincere people usually show complete congruence between their body language and their words. Their facial expressions naturally match their tone of voice, and their gestures flow without stiffness. In contrast, someone who is lying may display slight tension in their facial muscles, avoid eye contact or hold it unnaturally, speak at an altered pace, or even engage in self-touching gestures such as scratching their nose, touching their neck, or rubbing their hands together. These micro-behaviors are often associated with the mental effort involved in sustaining a lie, as the body enters a small, unconscious state of stress. The more complex the deception, the greater the cognitive load, and therefore, the more cues will escape. One of the most common behaviors in someone who lies is overcompensation. In an attempt to appear convincing, the liar may maintain prolonged eye contact, speak excessively formally, or add unnecessary details to their story. This need to fill in the blanks generates a convoluted narrative, which, when analyzed carefully, begins to show temporal, emotional, or logical inconsistencies. For example, recounting an event with excessive emotional precision, when in reality the event wouldn't justify such intensity, is often a red flag. True emotions have a rhythm of their own. They manifest themselves with a spontaneity that doesn't need to be justified. In contrast, feigned emotions often appear too quickly or too late, or lack the depth expected in that context. Another powerful indicator is the dissociation between verbalized emotion and the emotion displayed bodily. If a person claims to be happy, but their shoulders slump, their face tense, and their lips pursed, there is a conflict between what they say and what they truly feel. The body cannot help but project the dominant emotion of the moment, even if they try to cover it up. In fact, it is this contradiction that allows a trained observer to detect deception. The voice, for its part, also changes. It may become higher or lower, it may waver or become monotonous. The tone reveals tension when the nervous system is on alert, even if the person tries to appear calm. In some cases, silences before responding or repeated filler words are another clue that the mind is fabricating or adapting information in real time. Confronting a lie doesn't always require a direct accusation. In fact, doing so can generate resistance, evasion, or even unnecessary emotional escalation. A much more effective strategy is to observe, confirm patterns, and ask questions that invite precision. When you ask a specific question about a previously omitted detail, and the person hesitates or changes their story, that inconsistency speaks for itself. There's no need to say, "You're lying to me." Simply create spaces where the truth must be supported by facts. If it can't be supported, the story itself collapses. Furthermore, context is vital. You can't judge a gesture or reaction without considering the entire situation. Some people are naturally nervous or shy and might display signs similar to those of someone who is lying, without implying deception. Therefore, observation must be patient and comparative. How does that person normally behave when relaxed and speaking truthfully? What changes when addressing a specific topic? The difference is where the truth is hidden. Sudden changes in habitual behavior are more revealing than the gestures themselves. An advanced skill in this reading of human behavior is observing how someone reacts when they believe they are not being observed. Lies become more fragile when the liar lets their guard down. Therefore, the moments after a conversation, the gestures when you think the attention has ended, or the expressions upon leaving a compromising situation can be incredibly illustrative. There are micro-expressions of relief, frustration, or even pride if you feel you have successfully deceived. All these emotions, though brief, appear for moments on the face and body. Another effective technique is intentional silence. When a liar is telling a story, unexpected silence creates internal pressure. If the story is true, the person will have no problem following or explaining. But if there is deception, the silence forces them to improvise and fill in more details. This improvisation tends to be weaker, less coherent, and filled with unnecessary justifications. It's as if the silence draws the liar out of hiding, forcing it to expose itself without a shield. You can also use rephrasing, that is, repeating what the person said but with slight variations. This allows you to verify whether they stand by their story without flaws, or if they fall into subtle contradictions when having to adapt to the new form of the story. Finally, it's important to remember that identifying a lie shouldn't become an immediate moral judgment. Many people lie out of insecurity, fear, or emotional need, not always with the intention of harming others. Therefore, when you detect a lie, first ask yourself what that person is protecting, what they're trying to avoid, or what they're afraid to reveal. This will give you a deeper insight into the human being behind the mask. Understanding deception not only allows you to protect yourself but also develop empathy. Because every lie has a story, and every story has an emotion that needs to be understood. When you're able to detect lies without saying a single word, you become someone difficult to manipulate, someone who observes more than they react and who knows that the truth is revealed in the cracks, not always in speeches. The art of seeing beyond the obvious is a powerful tool for navigating the world with emotional intelligence, confidence, and wisdom. And it is precisely this ability to read the truth hidden between the lines that differentiates ordinary observers from true readers of human behavior. Chapter 9. Reading Insecurity, Fear, and Hidden Anger. There are emotions that are not clearly expressed, hidden behind forced smiles, prolonged silences, or postures intended to appear confident. Among them, insecurity, fear, and hidden anger are perhaps the most common and, at the same time, the most dangerous, both for those who suffer from them and for those who don't detect them in time. Understanding them is not only a powerful tool in communication, but also a way to protect ourselves from toxic relationships, unnecessary conflicts, or hasty decisions. Because behind every seemingly neutral gesture, an emotional storm often lurks, which can only be understood if we know what to look for and how to interpret it. Insecurity, for example, rarely manifests itself with the direct phrase, "I feel insecure." On the contrary, it often disguises itself as arrogance, rigidity, or even passivity. The body of an insecure person contracts slightly, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. The shoulders tend to hunch forward, and the arms are crossed not only as a shield, but as an unconscious sign of self-preservation. In other cases, excessive wordiness, attempts to justify everything, or the repeated use of phrases like, "I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Do you understand? I'm not sure, but," are small cracks in the wall of false confidence. It's insecurity speaking, not through the mouth, but through the need for constant validation. The gaze also gives away. When a person feels insecure in a setting, they avoid maintaining direct eye contact for more than a few seconds, as if afraid that meeting someone's eyes will reveal their lack of internal control. It also manifests in the way someone responds to criticism. Those who are confident listen, reflect, and filter. Those who aren't, defend themselves, justify themselves, or sink into awkward silence. Learning to notice these signs is key to adjusting the way we communicate with others, providing support when necessary or knowing how to set boundaries if someone's insecurity begins to become manipulative. Fear, on the other hand, is more elusive. It can hide behind nervous laughter, sudden movements, or a constant need to do something with the hands, as if the body were seeking to release accumulated internal tension. Fear isn't always expressed with words like, "I'm scared." Rather, it translates into actions such as avoiding certain conversations, abruptly changing the subject, rejecting proposals that involve exposure, or responding excessively cautiously to simple questions. The rhythm of breathing changes, the tone of voice becomes lower or more halting, and the person often excessively monitors the reactions of others, looking for signs of threat. This type of body language is especially evident when fear is experienced in front of authority figures, crowds, or contexts that involve judgment. The body goes into defensive mode without the person noticing. Hands clasped tightly, legs closed tightly, neck slightly tucked between the shoulders, as if the body wants to disappear. Fear can also hide under an appearance of excessive control. People who want to dominate every detail, foresee every move, organize everything down to the last detail. Often, behind this hyperactivity lies the fear of losing control, of something unexpected happening and not knowing how to react. It's not just about identifying fear in others, but also recognizing when we feel it, because the body expresses it even when the mind denies it. Covert anger, on the other hand, is an emotion that can go unnoticed for a long time, but its effects are cumulative and often destructive. It is not explosive, visible anger, but rather that which manifests as constant irritability, sarcasm, impatience, or emotional coldness. Someone who hides anger may maintain a polite smile, but their gestures are tense. Lips purse at the end of a sentence, jaws remain rigid, fingers drum impatiently, or feet tap the floor as if searching for an escape route. This repressed emotion also shows up in small passive-aggressive acts, unjustified delays, curt responses, selective forgetting, or an ironic tone. The body language of someone who feels anger and doesn't express it is usually contained, but always on the verge of boiling over. Brows furrow imperceptibly, blinking increases, and the general posture is rigid, as if something inside is resisting an explosion. In conversations, this type of person makes innuendos, jokes that aren't meant to make people laugh, but rather to make them uncomfortable, and their tone carries an emotional charge that doesn't match their words. For example, someone might say, "Nothing's wrong," but with such a dry intonation that it's obvious something is wrong, even if they don't say it. Detecting this incongruity is essential to avoid misunderstandings, prevent conflicts, or address situations that require emotional support rather than direct confrontation. Distinguishing between defensive and aggressive body language is a skill that develops with practice. The former seeks to protect, withdraw, and minimize exposure. The latter seeks to dominate, intimidate, or generate discomfort. For example, crossing one's arms can have multiple meanings depending on the context. It can be a sign of insecurity if the person shrinks slightly, but it can also be a sign of defiance if the person does so sticks out their chest, raises their chin, and holds their gaze firmly. Feet also reveal a lot. A closed stance, with feet pointing inward or toward an exit, usually indicates discomfort or a desire to escape. Conversely, an open stance, with feet firmly planted and slightly apart, can express confidence or, in some cases, aggression. Observing these details together is what allows for an accurate reading. No single gesture is definitive, but the complete pattern, the coherence between expressions, tone of voice, and body movement, offers a much more accurate snapshot of emotions than any words. This ability to read disguised emotions not only improves our ability to relate to others, but also acts as a mirror. Because what we detect on the outside is often what we deny on the inside. If we can see insecurity in others, we can also detect our own. If we can recognize the hidden fear in a gesture, we may also learn to be compassionate toward our own wounds. And if we understand hidden anger, we may be able to prevent it from escalating in ourselves or in those around us. Reading human behavior is not just an act of external observation. It is also a process of constant introspection. It is not about judging, but about understanding. Not about unmasking, but about empathizing. Because behind every unexpressed emotion lies a story, a fear, a wound, or a need. And only those who are attentive, present, and willing to listen with their eyes will be able to truly decipher what others dare not say. Chapter 10. How Posture and Personal Space Speak for Them. Posture and the use of personal space are two of the most powerful and often underestimated forms of nonverbal language. Unlike words, which can be easily shaped, rehearsed, or manipulated, how someone physically positions themselves in the world often escapes conscious control. It's as if the body speaks for itself, revealing truths that even the person isn't willing to admit. In analyzing human behavior, observing posture and the way someone protects or invades personal space becomes a profound, revealing, even definitive diagnostic tool. Because a person can say, "I'm fine," but if their body shrinks, their shoulders roll inward, their arms cross, and they make themselves small in front of you, there's a message that contradicts those words. And that contradiction is key to understanding what's really going on inside. A closed posture, for example, clearly indicates a need for protection, a sign of insecurity, or even a defensive reaction to what is happening. Crossing the arms, leaning back, hunching the shoulders, or keeping the feet pointed toward the exit are subtle but powerful signals that a person does not feel comfortable, safe, or in control. They may be experiencing fear, anxiety, internal judgment, or a simple need to emotionally distance themselves from the current situation. In contrast, an open posture, with the chest forward, arms relaxed, shoulders back, and the body slightly leaning toward the person they are speaking to, communicates confidence, receptivity, and mastery of space. These signals are intuitively perceived by most people, even if they don't consciously interpret them. That's why we tend to feel uncomfortable around someone who appears hunched or tense, and instead are drawn to someone who projects themselves with firmness and openness. Now, there is also a dominant posture, one that not only communicates confidence but also commands authority. It is characterized by an upright position, deliberate body expansion, such as sitting so that it takes up a lot of space or maintaining a high position in front of others, and a direct gaze. These postures are common in people who seek to lead, control, or influence their environment. They are not necessarily negative. In fact, they can be very useful in leadership, negotiation, or public communication contexts. However, when exaggerated or combined with tense facial expressions or invasive movements, they can become perceived threats to those around them. The body, in its attempt to establish power, can end up provoking rejection if it doesn't balance authority with empathy. That's why it's so crucial to understand that each posture conveys not only an emotion but also an intention, to protect, connect, defend, lead, avoid, or control. Personal space, on the other hand, refers to psychological boundaries. Each individual has a kind of invisible bubble surrounding them, an intimate zone that, if invaded without permission, can generate an intense, though subtle, emotional reaction. This space varies according to culture, context, and the relationship between people. In general, there are 4 widely recognized zones. The intimate zone, 0 to 45 centimeters, reserved for family members, partners, or close friends. The personal zone, 45 centimeters to 1.2 m, where interactions with acquaintances or colleagues occur. The social zone, 1.2 to 3.5 m, common in work or formal settings, and the public zone, beyond 3.5 m. Used in more impersonal contexts or for public exposure. When someone invades another's intimate zone without consent, it can provoke an automatic response of discomfort, rejection, or even defensive aggression, even if the person doesn't say a word. Territory also communicates power. If someone sits down and spreads their personal belongings across the table, they are signaling their dominance of that space. If, while speaking, they take a step forward while you step back, they are pushing your comfort zone to assert themselves. Therefore, in nonverbal language, it's not just what is said or how it is said that matters, but where it is said and how much space it occupies. Emotionally secure people tend to respect others' space, while insecure people can become invasive or, conversely, withdraw excessively. Both attitudes say more about their inner world than about the interaction itself. An effective leader, for example, knows how to balance their presence. They can fill a room with their energy without invading anyone's personal space. And they achieve this because they know and respect the silent codes of the space. There are also micro-gestures related to posture and space that reveal internal tensions. Someone may be sitting up straight, but if their feet point toward the door, their knees are slightly turned in another direction, or they keep their torso facing away from the other person, their body is signaling they want to leave. These signals, subtle but clear to those who observe them closely, reveal the true desire hidden behind verbal courtesy. The same thing happens with people who, feeling judged or exposed, lean their bodies back, cross their ankles, or grab their wrists. This is the body speaking of protection, tension, and alertness. Sometimes, these gestures even occur without the person being aware of them, as if their nervous system were acting automatically to keep them safe. On the other hand, there are people who expand their bodies exaggeratedly, who lean forward abruptly, who invade the other person's bubble with intense gestures, challenging looks, or expansive movements that seek to impose themselves. This type of behavior can be related to a need for control, insecurity compensated by dominance, or an intention to intimidate. And this is where body language becomes a kind of silent confession. Because the way a person positions themselves in space reveals not only their current emotion, but also their history, their inner beliefs, their unresolved wounds. It's no coincidence that someone who has been humiliated in the past adopts chronic defensive postures, or that someone who has always had to fight for attention takes up more space than necessary in every conversation. In conflict contexts, reading posture and space becomes especially useful. A person may be smiling, saying everything is fine, but if their body withdraws, if their hands clasp tightly, if their shoulders rise in tension, or if their legs are ready to rise and flee, the truth is revealed. There is discomfort, annoyance, perhaps fear. Learning to read these signs is like having an emotional radar that detects what others are trying to hide. And not for the purpose of manipulation, but to connect more deeply. Because when you understand what someone's body is saying, you can respond more empathetically, more accurately, more humanly. You can choose not to push when the other needs space, or to move closer when the other's body is asking for support, even if their words say otherwise. Ultimately, posture and the use of personal space are not just bodily gestures. They are silent declarations of identity. They reveal how someone feels about themselves, how they relate to the world, and what they expect from others. They are, in essence, a form of emotional language that, when learned to decipher, allows us to see beyond words, beyond masks. In a world where many hide their vulnerability behind well-structured discourses, the body remains the most honest channel. And learning to listen to it, with attention, with respect, with sensitivity, is one of the most powerful acts of human understanding you can develop. Chapter 11. The Art of Reading Silently. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is one of its most powerful languages. In a world where the majority compete to speak, stand out, convince, or simply fill the air with words, true power lies with those who learn to be silent and observe. Reading in silence doesn't simply mean remaining mute, but acquiring the ability to grasp everything that is happening while others rush to fill the void with information. Silence allows us to detect what is hidden behind speech, behind movements, even behind other people's pauses. When a person doesn't feel pressured to respond immediately, they unwittingly reveal more of themselves. In stillness, gestures take center stage. Glances, blinks, sighs, and micro-expressions become key elements of a language that only reveals itself to those who have learned to read without interrupting. Listening more than speaking then becomes a tool for decoding intentions, emotions, and contradictions that words try to camouflage. Well-managed silence can be uncomfortable, and in that discomfort, revealing. Many feel compelled to fill the gaps in a conversation because they fear what might emerge from stillness. That impulse to speak, to justify, to clarify without anyone asking, speaks volumes. Those who feel secure in their position don't need to rush to explain themselves. On the other hand, those who try to control the narrative with an avalanche of words usually have something they fear will come to light. Remaining silent at strategic moments allows us to see those cracks in another's confidence. It is in these moments that a slight tension in the jaw, a shift in posture, or a seemingly trivial sigh become revealing signs of what is really happening inside a person. Silence thus becomes a space of revelation, where what is left unsaid weighs more than any verbal affirmation. Another virtue of silence is that it forces the other person to confront themselves. When there is no intervention, no judgment, no advice, no immediate approval, the other person projects outward what they are processing internally. People often speak not only to communicate, but also to convince themselves. Often, while verbalizing an argument or an emotion, they seek validation in the other person's reaction. But when that validation doesn't come, when the only response is a firm and conscious silence, a mirror effect occurs. The speaker begins to revise their own discourse. They begin to question themselves, to backtrack, to reaffirm themselves, or to rephrase what they said. All of this can be closely observed by the person who has chosen the role of the silent reader. They don't need to say anything, because they are understanding everything. They are seeing the other person's internal construction in real time, without intervening, without contaminating the scene with their own judgment. But it's not just the observer's silence that's important. The other person's silence is as well. Many people have pauses in their communication that aren't mistakes, but rather emotionally charged moments. Awkward silences after a question. Long pauses before answering. Intervals between sentences that don't seek clarity but rather restraint. These silences are cracks through which emotional truth seeps. Learning to recognize and respect them, without interrupting or forcing a response, is a refined skill. In these moments, body language intensifies, Shoulders tense, gaze shifts, hands shake or clench. Everything speaks when words stop. And it is there that the silent reader sharpens their perception, not to interpret from their bias, but to gather the emotional data that escapes the interlocutor's control. Silence also creates an atmosphere of power, not of dominance, but of presence. A person who can remain silent without feeling inferior projects confidence. Their mere presence generates a positive tension that compels others to reveal more. In meetings, interviews, negotiations, or difficult conversations, the conscious use of silence gives one an advantage. When someone finishes speaking and doesn't receive an immediate response, they feel pressured to fill that void. In that rush to stay in the dark, they may say something they didn't plan to say, or reveal an intention they didn't want to reveal. Silence acts as a catalyst for truth, and that's why it's feared by many. But those who know how to manage it use it as a tool for deep reading, strategic provocation, and transformative listening. Furthermore, silence fosters trust building. Although it may seem contradictory, people feel more heard when they are not interrupted. Instead of filling the space with advice or their own stories, the silent reader lets the other person express themselves freely, without feeling they must compete for attention. This attitude creates an environment of respect where the other person relaxes and becomes more authentic. And in that authenticity, valuable information emerges. Fears, desires, contradictions, internal conflicts. All of this is revealed not because it was explicitly asked, but because silence opened the channel for it to flow. Thus, silence is not only a tool for detecting deception or tension, but also for building more real relationships, where attentive listening replaces the constant need to talk. It's also important to learn to distinguish between active and passive silence. The former is deliberate, strategic, observant. The latter is evasive, absent, disconnected. Those who remain silent out of discomfort or disconnection convey coldness or indifference. But those who consciously remain silent convey presence. And it's this presence that amplifies perception, allowing us to notice even what isn't being said. Because sometimes, the most important thing in a conversation is what isn't being said. The omissions, the detours, the evasions. Silence helps us detect these gaps and read what's hidden between the lines. Finally, those who master the art of silent reading not only understand others better, but also understand themselves better. In the act of observing without intervening, they also confront their own impulses, the desire to speak, to correct, to fill the void. They learn to tolerate their own discomfort, to resist the temptation to intervene, to observe without projecting. And in this process, they refine their perception not only of others, but of their own minds. Silence then becomes a form of active meditation, where each gesture of the other becomes a reflection of their own emotions, beliefs, and internal reactions. Reading in silence is an art, yes. But it is also a form of personal growth. A way of being present with full attention, with openness, and with a willingness to see beyond the obvious, beyond words. Because when the world talks non-stop, only those who know how to remain silent can truly hear what matters. Chapter 12. Detecting Recurring Emotional Patterns. Detecting recurring emotional patterns in people is one of the most revealing aspects of human behavior. While many fake their reactions to isolated events, the emotions that frequently emerge, those that are repeated even in different contexts, are like fingerprints of each person's inner world. Emotions don't appear by accident. They respond to internal structures, beliefs, wounds, fears, values, and deep needs that have been shaped throughout life. When someone repeatedly reacts with anger to criticism or with anguish to uncertainty, they are displaying more than a simple emotion. They are revealing an emotional pattern, an unconscious configuration that influences their way of living, interpreting, and relating to the world. Learning to read these patterns not only improves our interpersonal understanding, but also allows us to anticipate behaviors, connect more deeply, and establish more authentic and empathetic relationships. Observing which emotions repeatedly appear in a person requires sustained attention and genuine interest in what is happening beyond the words. It's not enough to notice explosive anger or fleeting sadness. The important thing is to see if those emotions frequently resurface in different situations, even if they don't seem justified. A person who consistently acts offended at the slightest criticism is probably not reacting only to what is said to them, but to a previous history of rejection, to an internal structure that interprets correction as an attack. Similarly, someone who appears excessively anxious in uncertain contexts may be revealing a deep fear of abandonment, loss of control, or insecurity. Fears that perhaps originated in early experiences and are activated whenever life is unpredictable. The emotional pattern is not what happens once, but what is repeated, what is activated without thinking, what seems automatic. And that, precisely, is what makes it so powerful and visible to those who know how to observe. Reading emotional personality involves looking beyond the visible, beyond gestures and words, and focusing on the type of emotion that governs someone's emotional life. Some people are emotionally anxious, living on high alert, always worried about what might go wrong. Others are emotionally reactive, getting angry easily, and feeling they must constantly defend themselves. Still others are emotionally avoidant, avoiding conflict, keeping quiet, and smiling even when hurt. This emotional style, this emotional personality, acts as a filter through which the person experiences the world. Someone with an emotional anxiety pattern will see threats even where there are opportunities. Someone with a repressed anger pattern may interpret every disagreement as betrayal. Someone with an emotional avoidant personality won't say what they feel, but will manifest it in their body language, their evasiveness, and their passivity. Understanding this is essential if we want to communicate effectively, as it's not enough to understand what they say, but rather the emotional state from which they say it. Emotional patterns are also revealed in the topics that dominate conversations. People who constantly complain, who always mention what they lack, the unfairness of circumstances, or what they weren't given, are not just recounting facts. They are displaying an emotional pattern of lack, frustration, and learned helplessness. Those who tend to speak from anger, criticism, or aggression are likely trapped in an emotional pattern of constant defense, where everything is perceived as a threat. On the other hand, those who repeat topics related to control, perfection, or efficiency are often driven by an emotional pattern of fear of making mistakes, fear of judgment, and a need for validation. This is where conscious and patient observation becomes a powerful tool, because it allows you to see beyond the literal content and begin to understand what emotion is organizing the discourse, what internal structure sustains it. Detecting recurring emotional patterns doesn't mean judging, but understanding. And that understanding is essential for developing real empathy. When you know that someone reacts angrily because they've lived in contexts where they had to constantly defend themselves, it's easier not to take their reaction personally. When you understand that someone is overly dependent because they fear abandonment, you can interpret their persistence not as a nuisance, but as an unresolved emotional need. This emotional understanding doesn't justify everything, but it does explain a lot. And that explanation, when it's profound, opens space for respect, compassion, and the possibility of influencing others more ethically and effectively. No one becomes insecure, controlling, or defensive for no reason. It's the result of their emotional history. And when that history becomes visible to you, you can speak to the human being behind the behavior. One key to detecting these patterns is observing disproportionate reactions. If a person explodes in anger over something seemingly trivial, if someone cries at an innocent comment, if someone emotionally flees when asked for a little more closeness, you are probably facing an emotion that doesn't correspond to the present, but to the past. Emotional patterns color the present with the colors of yesterday. They are automatic responses triggered by association, not logic. A minor argument can cause someone to relive feelings of abandonment if, in their childhood, disagreements always ended in estrangement. A mild criticism can be experienced as humiliation if there is a figure in their history who constantly criticized them. And so, what we see in the present is often only the echo of an unresolved emotion. Understanding this not only makes us wiser as observers, but also more aware as communicators. Furthermore, emotional patterns leave their mark on the body. Anxious people have rapid movements, labored breathing, speak hurriedly, touch their face, or rub their hands. Emotionally avoidant people tend to keep their distance, avoid eye contact, cross their arms, and close their posture. Those with suppressed anger patterns walk stiffly, tense their jaw, and pause for long periods before responding. The body is an open book when you know what to look for. You don't need someone to tell you they're afraid if you notice they subtly back away whenever something makes them uncomfortable. You don't need someone to confess they feel insecure if you notice they frequently repeat self-deprecating expressions or always seek approval with their eyes. These seemingly minor details become obvious clues when you observe them through the lens of emotional patterns. Reading these patterns can also help you identify your own emotional state. We all have patterns that are activated more than others. Some live more in anxiety, others in avoidance, others in hypervigilance, others in suppressed rage. Recognizing which emotion appears most frequently in your life is an act of internal honesty that transforms. What emotion dominates you when you're not acting consciously? What emotional reaction hijacks you when you feel losing control? What personal stories are behind those repeated emotions? When you begin to see yourself from that perspective, you also begin to free others from the burden of carrying your unresolved emotions. You stop reacting automatically and begin responding with awareness. And that is the foundation of a healthy emotional life. Detecting recurring emotional patterns isn't just about observing, but also about understanding their origins. Most of them are born in the first years of life, in environments where people learned that showing certain emotions was dangerous or that certain responses were necessary for emotional survival. A boy who was punished for showing sadness may develop a pattern of emotional denial. A girl who only received attention when she cried may repeat that pattern in her adult relationships. Emotional expression is inherited, ingrained, and normalized. And so, when we detect these patterns in others, we are seeing not only the adult who expresses themselves, but the child who once learned to protect themselves in that way. Seeing things this way makes us more human, more empathetic, and also more capable of intervening wisely. Ultimately, the art of detecting recurring emotional patterns becomes a compass for navigating human relationships. You no longer see just what the person is displaying, but what they need, what they fear, what they're dragging around. You see the story behind the gesture, the conflict behind the reaction, the emotion behind the silence. And from there, you can communicate more effectively, more consciously, and more compassionately. You can choose your words more precisely, your gestures with more intention, your presence with more power. Because you're not reacting, you're reading. And when you know how to read the recurring emotions of others, you also learn to write new possibilities into the way you relate to them. Chapter 13. The Past That Leaves Traces. The way a person responds today to everyday stimuli, emotional challenges, or human relationships is not only a reflection of their conscious present, but a constant echo of their deepest past. Past experiences, especially those marked by a high emotional charge, leave an indelible mark on the mind and body. An unhealed wound, an unprocessed betrayal, an emotional lack, or an experience of abandonment can become, unnoticed, the lens through which a person observes their entire reality. And it is there, in those reactive patterns that seem automatic, that the past speaks without asking permission. Reading a person, therefore, is not limited to what they show today, but to what their body, their micro-expressions, their silences, or their postural rigidity reveal about what they have not yet overcome. Because every defensive gesture, every avoidance, every disproportionate emotional tone in the face of a seemingly minor situation is often more closely related to yesterday than to today. A clear example is the reaction of someone who, faced with mild criticism, responds with excessive emotional intensity, anger, rejection, or even sudden tears. At first glance, one might think this is an impulsive or emotionally unstable person, but if we look more closely, if we look beyond the behavior, we might intuit that this person was perhaps raised in an environment where criticism was synonymous with humiliation, or where making mistakes was harshly punished. This reaction, then, is an automatic defense, a way of protecting oneself from a pain that was experienced before and that was not fully resolved. And that is what is projected. Not only what they feel today, but what they have not been able to let go of from the past. People are not always aware of these connections, but their body language and relational habits often betray them. The past also manifests itself in the way a person sets boundaries, trusts or distrusts others, or even how they position themselves physically within a group. Someone who experienced abandonment or emotional neglect, for example, might be overly accommodating, seeking to please everyone to avoid rejection. This need for constant approval isn't simply a personality trait. It's a reflection of an unhealed wound, a strategy developed in childhood to ensure affection or belonging. These types of people often adopt hunched body postures, with slightly drooping shoulders, a searching gaze, a permanent, though forced, smile, and self-soothing gestures such as rubbing their hands together or repeatedly touching their face. Their entire body says, "Please accept me," even if they don't express it with words. On the other hand, those who have experienced major betrayals or unstable relationships may develop a hypervigilant attitude. They observe everything. They distrust everyone. They analyze every word, every pause, every gesture. Their body language tends to be restrained, with minimal movements and tense posture, as if they're always waiting for an emotional blow. It's not that they don't want to relax, it's that they don't know how to do so without feeling vulnerable. In their minds, the past is still alive. The body, then, becomes an emotional time capsule, trapped in a present that continues to wage old battles. Reading this in someone requires sensitivity, not judgment. Because what you see is not simply an attitude, but a backstory that needs to be understood. Emotional trauma, even if mild or invisible, is one of the most powerful imprints the past can leave. These imprints often express themselves through the body in the form of chronic muscle tension, difficulty making eye contact, frozen responses to situations that require action, or even a type of smile that lacks real emotion. People with trauma-filled histories may appear distant, cold, or even unresponsive, but what's actually happening is that their nervous system has learned to protect itself by shutting down emotionally. This type of reading requires observing the small details: excessive blinking, flat tone of voice, prolonged silences, avoidance of physical contact. Each of these elements says, there was pain here, even if the person isn't aware of it. Even the way someone speaks can reflect their past. People who grew up in invalidating or emotionally censored environments may speak hesitantly, filling their sentences with fillers like, I don't know, maybe, sorry to say it like that, or even speak in such a low tone that it becomes difficult to hear them. Their insecurity isn't a current weakness. It's the result of years of feeling ignored, silenced, or criticized for expressing what they really thought. Their body language follows this pattern: head down, arms crossed in front of the chest, short strides, and lowered gaze. The body reflects exactly what the mind has learned: better not to stand out, better not to disturb. On the other hand, someone who lived in chaotic or violent environments may use the volume of their voice, their imposing posture, and their body language as mechanisms of control. It's not so much a display of real power as a preemptive defense strategy. Reading the past and the present is, in essence, a profound form of empathy. It's not about guessing what a person went through, but about understanding that every current behavior has a root. Often, when a person acts rudely, indifferently, or impulsively, it's not out of malice, but out of pain. And that pain, left untreated, manifests itself again and again in their relationships, their decisions, and above all, in their actions. Just as a poorly healed physical wound generates chronic discomfort, an unacknowledged emotional wound creates distortions in the way we interpret reality. Reading this accurately requires observing with the heart as much as with the eyes. Because there are things that are not seen with the naked eye but are felt in the air surrounding a person. Their energy, their way of inhabiting space, their need, or fear of contact. Understanding how the past shapes the present allows us to interpret others more deeply, but also ourselves. Often, when reading others, we see ourselves reflected in them. You observe an attitude and recognize that you, too, at some point, have acted from a place of hurt, not clarity. This recognition not only improves communication but also opens the door to more authentic relationships. Because when you understand where the other person's reaction comes from, you can respond with understanding rather than judgment. And that, on a human level, transforms relationships. The past leaves its mark, yes, but it can also leave wisdom. Because when you understand what shapes someone, you also understand what they need to feel safe, heard, and truly seen. Chapter 14. Read to connect, not to manipulate. One of the most common mistakes when delving into the world of emotional and behavioral reading is assuming that these skills are tools designed to control or dominate others. This belief, although tempting, distorts the true purpose of this skill. Reading others should not stem from a desire to gain an advantage, but from a genuine intention to understand. When we observe someone not to judge them, but to accompany them from their emotional truth, the impact is completely different. It's not about predicting what they will do or discovering their weaknesses, but about creating a bridge of connection that transcends words. True emotional reading is not exercised from a place of power, but from empathy. The line between empathy and control may seem subtle, but it's actually abysmal. Empathy seeks to understand, while control seeks to direct. When someone reads another's emotions to know how to support them, that reading becomes a tool of compassion. On the other hand, if someone reads to know what to say, how to act, or what to do to provoke a specific reaction in the other, the reading becomes manipulation. This distinction is not only ethical but also spiritual. Because whoever uses emotional understanding for personal gain sooner or later loses the most valuable thing, the other's trust. Connecting requires opening up to the other without masks or expectations, setting aside judgment, and observing with humility. Seeing is not the same as observing. Seeing is automatic. Observing implies deep attention. Reading to connect involves being present, letting the other express themselves even in their silence, even in their contradiction. Sometimes, someone who seems angry is actually hurt. Sometimes, someone who seems cold is scared. And that information isn't in what they say, but in what their body and energy reveal. But if we read from a place of superiority or strategy, we miss the deeper message behind every gesture. Furthermore, when we position ourselves from a position of empathy, we begin to notice patterns, not to pigeonhole the other, but to understand their emotional mechanisms. For example, if someone reacts irritably when criticized, we might interpret this as a wound of inadequacy. This interpretation shouldn't lead us to avoid confronting them or exploiting their insecurity, but rather to treat them with more sensitivity. Perhaps direct criticism isn't the best approach, and emotional validation is needed first. This approach isn't manipulation, it's respect. Because respecting the emotions of others, even if we don't fully understand them, is part of the art of connecting. Another key point is the responsible use of this skill. Knowing how to detect hidden sadness, insecurity in a posture, guilt in a forced smile, can lead us to make snap judgments. But this is where we must pause and ask ourselves, why am I observing this? What is the intention behind my reading? Because if, upon recognizing an emotion in the other person, we decide to use that information to provoke something, we have lost our purpose. Emotional reading must be silent, delicate, and filled with respect. We are not stripping the other person bare to take advantage of their vulnerability, but rather to accompany them from a human place. In fact, people sense when someone is reading them with respect or judgment. It goes without saying, it's felt. Because nonverbal language isn't just what we emit, but also what we absorb. If your gaze conveys compassion, the other person relaxes. If your presence doesn't convey judgment, the other person lowers their guard. But if they sense an inquisitive attitude, or a hidden desire to direct them emotionally, they will shut down. That's why the intention with which we read the other person is even more important than the accuracy of what we detect. Because reading correctly without ethics is like having a key that's used to force doors, not to open them with consent. Responsible emotional reading also involves understanding that each person is unique. What for one person is a sign of sadness may be a natural way of expressing themselves for another. We mustn't fall into the error of universalizing signs. Every body, every story, every emotion has its own logic. That's why reading to connect also involves questioning, validating, not assuming. Sometimes, the best way to interpret what someone is feeling is to ask them openly, are you uncomfortable with this? Are you okay with what I just said? What do you need right now? Because that genuine openness breaks through any attempt at manipulation and transforms it into an act of real presence. Finally, reading to connect also implies a commitment to oneself. Because the more refined your ability to observe others, the more your inner awareness is activated. You also begin to read your own emotions, your intentions, your automatic reactions. And in that mirror, you discover that emotional reading is not an outward act, but a dance between the internal and the external. It forces you to be more aware, more honest, more present. It is a practice that is refined every day, not only to better understand others, but to better understand ourselves. Because true connection, the deepest and most transformative, occurs not only when we understand others, but when we allow that understanding to transform us as well. Conclusion. Understanding others is an act of wisdom and power. Understanding others is not a trick to gain an advantage, nor a formula for controlling others. It is, above all, an act of profound wisdom, an exercise in humility and respect for human complexity. Reading people like a book is not a strategy of manipulation, but an invitation to see beyond the superficial, to connect with what is truly happening inside each person, even when they themselves have not yet verbalized it. Because often, the emotions that speak the most are not those that are spoken, but those that filter through in a gesture, a pause, a glance that lasts a second longer than normal. And when we are mindful enough to notice these microsignals, we are not only improving our perception, we are fine-tuning our empathy, developing a deep respect for what each individual carries, feels, and keeps quiet. The true purpose of reading people is not to judge or categorize them, but to understand them. It's not to place others in mental boxes, but to open those boxes and look inside with curiosity and compassion. Because behind every rigid posture, every defensive word, every forced laugh or prolonged silence, there are stories, wounds, dreams, fears, and desires that, sometimes, not even that person has been able to decipher. And that's where your power comes in. Not to expose, but to understand. Not to confront, but to accompany. Not to manipulate, but to build a genuine bridge between two minds, between two emotions, between two souls coexisting in a world overloaded with stimuli, but hungry for real connection. When you become someone who observes, who listens with your eyes, who feels with your skin, who notices the nuances in the voice, the rhythms in breathing, the contradictions between gestures and words, you are accessing a type of intelligence that isn't taught in school, but that makes a difference in life. It's not just about knowing more about others, but about becoming more aware of yourself. Because the more you develop your ability to read others, the more you discover your own ways of reacting, your blind spots, your unresolved areas. External reading always also reflects internal reading. And this is where all learning makes sense. There is no mastery of observation without ethical responsibility. There is no wisdom without humility. There is no true power without purpose. You can use this skill for many things. To negotiate better, to lead with greater emotional intelligence, to accompany difficult processes, to protect yourself from toxic relationships, to understand your partner, your child, your boss, yourself. But the essential thing is never to forget that the gift of reading is not a tool for domination, but for service. To generate greater clarity in a world of confusion. To bring truth in an environment where masks are superfluous. To build relationships that don't depend solely on words, but on presence, on mutual understanding, on authenticity. Every person you interact with is telling you a story, even in silence. The way they sit, the way they move their hands, the tone of their voice when they talk about themselves, how often they look down, the gestures they repeat without realizing it, the topics they avoid, the smiles that don't reach their eyes. It's all valuable information if you know how to observe from the right place. From a place of genuine interest, from deep empathy, from the desire to understand and not just interpret. Because in the end, the key isn't to interpret emotions like a cold analyst, but to feel them like a real human being. Mastering this skill changes you. Not just externally, but internally. You begin to see the world through different eyes. You become more patient, less reactive, more compassionate, less rigid. You understand that people aren't always what they appear to be, that there are layers behind every behavior, that most behaviors have an emotional logic, even if it's unconscious. And that sets you free. Free from unnecessary judgments, free from conflicts that aren't worth it, free from impossible expectations. Because by understanding others better, you also understand yourself better. And that mutual understanding is what creates real bonds, transformative conversations, encounters that leave a lasting impression. Emotional and behavioral reading isn't a skill you can perfect. It's a constantly evolving art. Each person you meet offers you a new page, a new chapter, a new body language to learn to decipher. And the more you practice it, the more natural it will become. It's not about searching for cues like a robot, but about being fully present, attentive, and receptive. It's in that conscious presence where the magic really happens. When you stop talking for the sake of talking, imposing for the sake of imposing, and start listening to what isn't said, observing what isn't easily revealed, sensing what lies beneath the surface. You've come a long way in this audiobook. You've learned to recognize micro-expressions, postures, voice changes, revealing silences, hidden emotions, behavioral patterns, and profound dynamics that influence all human interactions. But beyond technical knowledge, if this journey has awakened in you a more open, deeper, and more conscious perspective on others, then the goal has been fulfilled. Because it's not just about knowing how to read others, but about understanding why. To build healthier relationships, to heal invisible wounds, to lead with understanding, to live with greater emotional intelligence. Understanding others is, ultimately, an act of love and a sign of maturity. It's choosing awareness over reaction. It's embracing the complexity of being human without needing to simplify everything. It's looking through another's eyes and saying, I see you beyond what you show. That's true power. That's the greatest gift you can offer and receive. And now that you know how to do it, The next step is to practice it with humility, integrity, and wisdom. Because when you understand others, you don't just create connection. You transform lives, starting with your own. So, if this audiobook inspired you and you're ready to continue delving deeper into your personal growth and inner transformation, I invite you to discover another eye-opening audiobook that will change the way you see the world, your decisions, and your potential. Click here, and I'll see you there.